Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Dr. Drew Ramsey here. Let's talk about some of my favorite terms when it comes to mental health and psychiatry. These are ideas and terms I use almost every day in my clinical work as a psychiatrist. I also use them personally as I'm trying to understand my own mind, and I find them very helpful. So I wanted to list out 9 of my favorites. Number one, biopsychosocial model. This is the model of modern psychiatry by which we understand there are many different factors at play when we're struggling with our mental health. There's the biological, the idea that our genes and our biology impact how we feel. We all know on some fundamental level this is true. If you want to test this out, skip lunch and dinner today and see how you start to feel. Probably a little hungry, irritable, grumpy. That's a biological response that you're having in terms of your mood. Same thing, you want to feel a little anxious, you can put yourself in a number of settings that would probably do this. So that probably is more of a psychological response, this idea that thoughts and your surroundings and your response to them, your psychology, is the origin of some symptoms. And then there's our social factors significantly impact how we're feeling. We all know that based on, for example, conflicts within a relationship triggering a lot of different feelings. So biopsychosocial model is a very nice model of looking at our mental health because it gives us a lot of different angles to understand how we're feeling and acknowledges that a complex human emotion has a lot of different inputs. It's not usually just one thing. All right, the next term is psychodynamic. This is a very important term to me as a psychodynamic psychiatrist. This means I'm a psychiatrist who practices through a lens of psychodynamics, which is a belief that the unconscious is alive and exists, and that symptoms are often generated because of conflicts within our psyche, conflicts within that classic Freudian triad that we'll talk about in a moment of our id, superego, and our ego. But psychodynamics gives us this notion that there's something dynamic and at play and moving, and that the generation of those conflicts and understanding of those conflicts is part of how symptoms get generated, but also how we get better. Number three, the unconscious. Now, this is a fundamental principle in psychodynamic psychiatry, the idea that we have awareness of some of the things going on in our lives, but some of our reactions and feelings and ideas even are unconscious, that we're not fully consciously aware of them or not aware of them at all. A good example of that in clinical practice is an anniversary reaction. Let's say someone loses a significant family member, and then about a year later, often, you'll see there's a real kind of sudden and sad feeling that can be very disoriented. Right? In the unconscious mind, there's a real awareness and a picking up on of all of the cues going on, the change in seasons, just a reminder that it's the time of year when this loved one passed, but there's not any conscious awareness. A patient will come in and say, I really don't know why I'm feeling badly. And if you let them kind of settle down and associate, often you'll begin to hear about the loved one that they've lost. So that's an example of the unconscious, things that we're not aware of that are influencing our mood. And it's one of the real benefits of psychodynamic treatment and being in treatment is this notion of increasing awareness. All right, the next three kind of go together. The first is going to be the superego, and if you've wondered where guilt comes from in the kind of Freudian model of the mind, but the model of the mind that really dominates modern psychology today, is that the superego is our internalized set of parental values and societal values that allow us to really determine what's right and what's wrong. And so superego is where kind of guilt and shame and this notion of doing the right thing come from. So if you were raised in a household with a lot of really strict rules or a very strict regimen, let's say, of religious beliefs, that's going to influence your superego and how you think about what is good, what should be done, what you should feel guilty or shameful about. The superego is often paired or in opposition to this next term, which you'll often hear, the id. And the id is the notion of our hedonistic drives. Usually this is defined as sexual drives and aggressive drives. Our desire, as some psychoanalysts will say, to mate and to kill. we would add in, or I would encourage us to think about more of the modern psychoanalysts who've also talked about this other drive, which is our drive to connect and to relate. And I think that's really, really important, and has always resonated with me as a clinician. Yes, people are interested in sex. Yes, people struggle with aggression, but also we really have this desire to belong and to connect. That's a fundamental drive. And in between these drives, our next idea, the next concept is ego. And it's important to say this today, not as a bad word. So often in the psychedelic movement, there's a fetishization of ego death, of getting rid of the ego, getting rid of the self. And we can talk about that in another video, but I find it just to note that a lot of us in practice have spent a lot of time with patients working on ego strength. Actually, ego strengthening is one of the goals of psychotherapy, your ability to navigate between all these impulses and drives that we have and the guilt and the shame that we can feel, and just sort of thread the needle. Your ego is what allows you or helps you to do that. And so ego functions like increasing our frustration tolerance and patience, getting into a state of mind where we can use not just how we're feeling, but also some of our thoughts and our history to make decisions and to react, to really utilize and strengthen the best of what we have in our prefrontal cortexes and those parts of our brain that think and reason and work towards being stable and consistent in our identity. So those are three concepts that go together a lot, and I find get thrown around, right? Get rid of your ego, is a kind of common idea here, that ego gets confused with selfishness and the self, as opposed to ego function, which is something you should be very interested in, because ego functioning is what allows us to have prowess and competence in this world. Okay, next couple concepts, the idea of transference. Now, transference is why therapists don't say a lot about ourselves. It begins with this classic idea of the blank screen that in some ways doesn't work, right? If people aren't responsive or empathic and they're sitting with us, we kind of sometimes have a bit of a negative reaction, right? If you're telling me a very sad story and I don't have any reaction, that would feel abnormal. But transference is the idea that your relational patterns and some of your unconscious mind gets projected onto the relationship with the therapist. So transference are the thoughts, feelings, and ideas that you have about your therapist. So if you think that I'm really going to judge you, or I'll have patients say, I don't want to share this because I'm sure you're going to, you have some really strong opinions about this. Or if you have an idea that your therapist really likes you, you're their favorite patient by far. Right? These are all fantasies and ideas around the transference, around the relationship with the therapist. Paired with this is CounterTransference. Those are the thoughts, feelings, and ideas that we therapists have about our patients. And it's a really, really important piece of data. If you come in and I'm instantly just think you're the just wonderful, or have an opposite reaction, I'm really concerned and worried or even anxious or paranoid, right? All that is great data to help understand what's going on with you in your situation. All right, next concept to think about is resistance. Resistance is what therapists refer to as what prevents people from being open and sharing. It prevents us from being vulnerable. Resistance is why we're often late to treatment, or why we put off that evaluation, or why we miss a session and had no idea. It wasn't at all in our mind, right? How does something so important slip our minds? Well, that's resistance. And it's the idea that in some ways the mind wants to stay where it is and wants to prevent some of the pain of being vulnerable, being exposed, talking about some of the challenges and difficulties that were happening. Okay, and then the last idea that I wish everybody knew was thinking about defenses. Defenses, everybody's got them. We've all got them. It doesn't mean you're a defensive person. In some ways, it means we're all defensive people. Defenses exist for really good reasons. When we have difficult or challenging parts of ourselves, or painful experiences, or traumas, or a feeling of not being understood or heard or seen, right? We create defenses, psychological defenses around these. So a good example of a defense is intellectualization. You could argue this video is a little bit of that. We're going to come up with all these terms and terminologies for how we're feeling. We're going to talk a lot about the ideas, but we're not actually going to sit with the feelings. I remember years ago evaluating a very, very smart scientist, and about an hour into the evaluation, I was hearing all the details of like the physics of black holes, but I hadn't heard anything about him. It's a good example of intellectualization. As much as I was intrigued and pulled in and fascinated by how much he knew, we weren't there to talk about black holes in that sense. We were there to talk about the black hole in his life in terms of how he was doing. And so it's an example of intellectualization. Another couple great defenses, humor, right? You're joking around a lot. If you got that friend who's always joking, always yucking it up, always making a joke, oftentimes that's seen as a healthy but still a defense, and a defense around sitting with the complexity of real feelings, of maybe joking instead of sitting with something, for example, that's difficult or painful. Those are some concepts and ideas that have been prominent in my life as a psychiatrist, as I've been thinking about the mind and about mental health, and helping people think about how to get better with their mental health. I hope they're ideas that are helpful to you. A lot of them get tossed around, and a lot of them have very complex definitions, but I just wanted to give you a sense of these phrases and words, and some of their meaning and what they mean to me, and how I think they're helpful in our pursuit for better mental health and better mental fitness. Thanks so much. Please subscribe so you don't miss any of these videos, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.